This is Zero Signal, where security leaders stop waiting for certainty and start leading through it. I'm Conor Sherman.
And I'm Stuart Mitchell.
Let's get into it. Zero Signal is brought to you by Sysdig. Threat actors are compromising cloud accounts in under 8 minutes. Vulnerabilities are being exploited within 10 hours of disclosure. That's the defender's window, and it keeps closing. Attackers aren't waiting on dashboards. They go straight for what's running. Real time is the only timeline that matters. And that's why Forrester named Sysdig a leader in its latest wave for the cloud-native application protection platforms. Runtime is where real risk shows up, and runtime is what Sysdig is built for. So stop watching and start defending. Learn more at sysdig.com and check out the link in the description. Welcome to Zero Signal. I'm Conor Sherman. We've got a rare solo host for you today. So today on Zero Signal, we're speaking with Matt Peters, the co-founder and CEO of Fixify, the former chief product officer at Expel, former VP of worldwide operations at Mandiant during the height of the APT era. Today, we're going to be diving into why AI is a Captain America-like serum for most organizations, how incidents are being transformed by AI, and also how artificial intelligence for most organizations is built on a broken technology foundation, so that you as a security leader can walk in your next AI governance meeting with your CIO, your CFO, or your board and name exactly where AI will pay out an ROI, where you're going to get burned, and what you need to be doing about it. So, Matt, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's bust right into it. So your team recently republished the 2026 benchmark report. You looked at 50,000 tickets across 30 different organizations, and I found this headline to be really insightful. And that was these tickets were being resolved 16 times faster with AI than without AI, but the first response times were identical. So I wanted you to unpack that a little bit, like help me understand what's the gap here and what does this mean for security technology leaders?
It's a great question. So if you imagine for a second, so the types of organizations that we're surveying are people who have sort of dialed in their operations pretty well. So back in the day, pre-AI, most operations would have sort of a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3. So they have the segmentation. And the main deal was that their tier 1 was primarily there to do real quick triage, like what kind of issue is this? Can we solve it immediately, or does it have to go somewhere else? And so that, because those things are very, very short cycle times, they're very, very deterministic. You can actually get response times to be very, very predictable. And so people dialed that really far in. And it's sort of like the table stakes of running a decent help desk or service desk or something like that is that your first time to first response is really, really dialed in, right? So along comes AI, and it's like, well, awesome. So we're going to do that same sort of thing, but you're going up against an operation that's really pretty well dialed in, and it's dialed in to what I would call human expectations. So if you imagine for a second, you're in Slack, you type a thing, or you send an email ticket or something like that. You're expecting a response in human timescale. So optimizing any further than like it takes 60 seconds or 90 seconds to get a response is not actually going to move the needle. What turns out, though, is the long tail. Once it's not a tier 1 request, but it's a tier 2 request. Oh, you need access to this application. We need to go ask, Bob in security, or we need to go, validate with your boss, or hey, we need to do some debugging. Those actually involve a lot of backing and forthing in the organizations, and that's where those response times get really, really long. It's not like you're working the whole time. It's literally like you're sitting around waiting for someone.
Right.
Humans do that really bad. There's no world in which I'm going to go ask Bob in security, send him a Slack, and then wait on tenterhooks till he responds so I can immediately pick that up and close it, right? So I'm going to go on and do something else if I'm a human and I'm working on 17, 18 things, and the security guy gets back to me. Well, I'm not going back to that ticket until I'm done with whatever I'm doing here. So you just build in a tremendous amount of sort of slop into that process. That's the kind of fat that AI can trim out, right? AI will sit there and wait, and like, an automation can automatically say, oh, okay, this is what happened. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the right thing. And those classes of automations have existed for a long time, but what AI has done is made it so that like it's easier for them to deal with the sort of the varietals, the variations in the organization, the variations in the response. So if one of the common ones is in an application access request, a lot of times you'll have like a button that says yes, approve or disapprove. Like that's how you do the flow. So you send a little Slack message. And what happens if the end user just responds with, yup, sounds good? Well, a previous generation of automation that was just stupid would be like stuck at that point. It's broken.
Yeah.
But an AI automation may have enough discernment to be like, that is the same as them pushing the button. I got it from here. I'm going to go. And so that's what's tightening up that response time and getting those things significantly better.
That's really interesting. So I really love that example too. So, for those who know my background, like most organizations I go into, it's like I go in to run security, and then you realize, okay, well, to get the security outcomes, you need to transform the IT, you need to do the infrastructure. Like all these things kind of come along for the ride. So in multiple organizations I've run, security IT reported to me as well. And what I always found that like with permissions is it's like, oh, I need access to such. And then there's this whole back and forth of like, well, what kind of access? Who are we modeling after? How long do you need it? And all these kind of things. So do you see that with AI in the IT space being able to solve those kind of, I don't know, those context-oriented things? Or am I just kind of like hoping for a future that will one day exist?
Well, I think it's sort of a part way in between those two, right? So one of the things, and actually I quote, there's a really interesting report that just came out. It was by the guys at the Stanford AI economics, lab. And they basically published a report where they looked at like 50 or so different AI deployments. One of the things that they found in that was in about 70% of the problems AI deployments run into is actually not technology related. It's all organizational, right? And when you look at like app access is a perfect example of an organizational problem rather than a technological problem. If somewhere in the organization there existed a map of, for every single application, here's who owns it, here's who approves access, this is the hours they work on, here's the policy done, then this would actually be a trivially technological problem. But what we found, and this is actually sort of a little bit of the bailiwick of the company, is we go in and our platform sort of automatically discovers applications. We build out this matrix by looking at all the trouble tickets and things like this. And it is shocking, one, how many applications an average company has. Like the average company that we're talking about has over 150 applications, right? And so there's a non-trivial chance that the IT team literally doesn't know off the top of their head that they have that app, let alone what the approval process is. And then you've got to figure out, okay, what's mission critical, what's got private data in it, all that sort of stuff. So the real issues are all of those things. It's the cataloging part. And then once you have that, it's like, okay, now we can build a process around it. And that's one of the things that we found is so interesting, is so much of the lift to get security and IT lined up is much more around, okay, what do we have? Like, what the hell's, I mean, and you know this, right? A big chunk of my career was cybersecurity, and the number of places I'd walk in and just be like, I'm going to talk to you for an hour, and at the end of it, I'm going to draw a picture of your sort of threat landscape and network, and I would do it, and everybody would be like, "Can we keep that? Because we didn't have that before." And I was just like, "It's
Yes.
the organizational infrastructure that you just don't have, right?"
Yeah. So actually, for everyone who's listening, I will link this as show notes. So that's actually a really good report. It just came out from the Enterprise AI Playbook. It's lessons from 51 successful deployments, and this is from the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. Is that the one?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And in there, one of the things that's super useful is they did a great job of kind of boiling down some really, really good lessons learned in that report about, the kinds of things that people run into. That organizational friction was one. One of the other things to call out there that they ended up talking a lot about was what kind of work ended up benefiting from AI more than other types of work. So that was actually kind of interesting. It turns out that certain types of approval workflows and stuff and sort of configurations around those were much more effective as things to automate. So I thought that was fascinating.
And so as I pulled this up, I just thought it was really interesting because they referenced something that I wanted to bring into the conversation as well, which was your take on the MIT study that came out in 2025. And that was the one that grabbed a lot of attention, and just like everything in today's world, it's like tons of attention that immediately moves on. But there was actually some really good insights in there. And the thing I thought was insightful from the 2025 study out of MIT, this is the NANDA initiative that looked, and they're the ones who had the conclusion that 95% of the GenAI pilot programs failed to produce any measurable financial output. That was like their big headline. Yeah. But of course, it wasn't the technology. And their conclusion was it was a misalignment of organizational incentives. And so I wanted to get your take on that. Right. So you've come out of cybersecurity. You are the height. There couldn't be better pedigreed cybersecurity companies that you've worked for. So between Mandiant and the work with ATPs, and then going into Expel, which I love that MDR company. I mean, if I could like get an Expel tattoo somewhere, I probably would one day. Like I've brought them to 3 organizations, huge fan of what they built. And then you went over to Fixify. So you're now in this IT transformation space. can you tell us a little bit more what's your perspective as you see IT across these companies? I'd love to hear two parts. One is like, what is your view in this moment of how do we get those incentives aligned correctly so that we can see the transitions? And what are some of the common struggles, pain points, patterns, or anti-patterns that you see across customers and across the industry at large?
Sure. And I'd start out by just saying I thought that the MIT study was an interesting one, and I think it was good. It's always nice, and particularly on LinkedIn, you got to drop something that's going to be really, really like a bombshell, and so the 95% failure rate grabbed a lot of attention. But one of the things that the Stanford Digital Economy Lab study found of the 51 things that they looked at, and these were 51 successful programs, was that 60% or so of those had a previous failure. Right. So they had they had tried the project before and it had actually failed. And then they had taken organizational learnings from that and then gone on to succeed. And so one of the things I think we're going to see is that last year and part of this year has been like sort of testing. But we are seeing at Fixify, tons of our customers are now showing up going like, okay, it's time to really do this for real. Right. So I think that we are going to see, an uptick. The patterns in terms of organizational alignment. So the first one is, I think, and I'm gonna actually, and I apologize for bringing up books and stuff like this.
No, that's the difference. See, you're smart and you bring up books, and you have this incredible bookshelf behind you. I have gray blank behind me, so it's a reflection of our intellect.
I'll take it. Anyway, so there's a guy named Scott Berkun who wrote a book called The Myths of Innovation. He was just sort of talking about like, what are the stories that we tell about how technology and things like this like happen, basically? How does innovation happen? One of the things that he talks a lot about was, interestingly, we spend a lot of time focusing on effectively solutions. We sit here and like, oh, okay, we're going to get this technology or we're going to do this and that sort of stuff. And not a hell of a lot of time focused on the problem. And he's like, problem definition is actually where most of the time ought to be spent. And I think that that's a thing. When I think about all of the AI projects that we've seen, even the ones we've done internally, and the ones that are successful versus unsuccessful, is the people who were using it were saying, I have an enabling technology. Cool. Now put that off to the side for a second. Let's talk about the problem I'm trying to solve. Right. So in this context, as a business, you're looking at things and you're going, okay, I want to identify a clear, like a process I want to change and I want to improve something. Okay, let's go do that. Right. Or I want to rework the way that we do a particular thing. And the outcome I'm looking for is an improvement in metric X or an improvement in process Y, something like this. Starting with something that's pretty concrete and pretty understandable is one of the ways we found to cut through some of the organizational friction that you end up getting there as a thing. There's a second thing, and like this is where it gets kind of interesting, I think, thinking about the idea that people are going to almost immediately react to changes. Like people are change averse. That is just what happens. Like you will end up with the foot dragging and things like this. And what we've found, both internally again and with our customers, is thinking about enablement slightly differently. You're talking about, in a lot of cases, a profound change. If you're thinking about agentic technologies or the large language model type things, these are profound changes in people's workflows. And so actually doing much more close in enablement. So let's say you were going into your legal department and saying, we're going to rework the way that we do contract approval and we're going to use this new leveraging technology. Ordinarily, what an IT team would do is say like, okay, great, we're going to set this thing up. We're going to get it configured. We're going to talk to you about all the processes and stuff. We're going to get all the things lined up and things like that. And then we'll be back in a week to find out how it's going, right?
Right.
In this context, you're actually probably going to want to sit down next to each person in the department and be like, let's solve a problem together using this new tool. Let's get you familiar with it, that sort of stuff. Because in a lot of cases, there's just such a huge ramp to like, I'm now talking to a thinking machine. What the hell? And that alone is a huge barrier to adoption.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, it makes sense on paper. Like when you say it out loud, you're like, well, of course that's what we do. But then you go to practice and you're like, no, we throw PowerPoint decks or Google Slides at each other. And then we say, I'll see you in 3 weeks' time how's our KPI doing? Yeah. But the reality is actually, no, we need some hand-holding and some coaching. And we need to stop thinking about it like as a negative. And actually, that's the only way to make the transformation.
Well, and I can't remember. There's some author that was quoted saying like the most impenetrable thing is a blank page. And one of the things I think is so interesting is this like corporate motion, which is like we got everybody Claude licenses. So now you're sitting down in front of a prompt. There is no guidance on what the hell this thing even knows how to do. And so like now I have my day job. So let's keep that in mind. And then I've got to do this thing as well, right? there is a repetitive stat. This comes up in a lot of different places where when you first start rolling out AI, you end up seeing a drop in productivity, right? And so one of the other things is you've got to be prepared for the subsidiary metrics to go down a little bit while your team is picking up this new workflow. And one of the things I think is so fascinating is this sort of weird 1-2 that people do of like, I'm going to bring in the robots, I'm going to fire a bunch of the people. So now the other people are overworked. They're really stressed out. They have no time to learn this new technology. And then you're going to wonder why it failed and you got to hire all those people back. And that's actually a pattern we see play out in a number of companies where they basically ended up being like, this was a catastrophic failure. It really wouldn't have been if the organization sat down and said, we are going to make sure everyone is on board. We're going to do the standard change. All of the unsexy business of being world-class at technology is largely about getting humans lined up in the same direction. That's just over and over again, and it's sort of motherhood and apple pie. If I could, I might wax eloquent on one other thing though, which is like the magic here. The reason why it might be worth it, right, is, and this actually comes from another book called Predictions Machines, and these guys were talking about the idea that AI has fundamentally changed the unit economics of particular activities, right? So whenever that happens in the world, so whenever it happens that like the cost of something drops, the immediate assumption and the kind of the dumb executive assumption is, okay, we'll just do more of that. Sounds good. Okay, that's cheap now. Let's do more of it, right? It doesn't really work like that. What actually ends up happening is you end up, if you're smart, you rework everything around that. So for instance, as the historical analog, shipping containers dropped the cost of shipping freight around the world. Right. Okay, you could say, well, let's just ship more freight. What we actually did was we said, now we can move manufacturing to other parts of the world. We can now have supply chains that stretch across the globe. Like worlds changed. And so one of the things that we see a lot of is people who are looking at AI and going, okay, rather than just make something cheaper, I'm going to re-envision the whole thing around it. So as an example, right, one of the things is like, instead of doing segmentation in marketing, I have different customers in different buckets and that sort of stuff so I can speak to each one. Now I can just do direct personalization. Human judgment got cheap enough that that's possible now, right? And so you can re-envision the entire way that your marketing team functions if you can lean into a distinction like that. So anyway, the risk of going on, that's one of the other observations I have is like leaders not thinking big enough and then not taking the moment to align the organization behind that vision and saying, okay, this is like, we're going to the far green country and now we're gonna move there together.
I got a really long list of books to go read.
Yeah,
now.
Sorry about that. I do that to everybody. It's probably one of my most annoying, among many annoying character flaws. Yeah.
One of the things that you've shared as well is this idea that like AI is this Captain America serum.
Yeah.
I don't want you to expand on that a little bit because I think it ties into the direction you were talking about, because I think that insight that maybe one of the problems we're having right now with this AI transformation is this twofold thing of A, not thinking big enough, and then I heard not thinking big enough, and then not being patient enough. Mm-hmm. And those two things in tandem is causing an unnecessary amount of anxiety. That was kind of, as you were laying that out, I was like, oh, okay, I could see how a CISO who's trying to like rebuild their org, be AI first in their defense, could just be trying to solve yesterday's problems with a faster technology. But anyway, So I thought that was a really kind of a good insight there, that we actually need to think about bigger, and then we can think about having the patience to do the investment on that.
I mean, that's how you achieve, at the end of the day, if you're trying to achieve an outsized ROI, or you actually think you can like really move, I think there's some tremendously transformational technology here, and the poverty of the vision of like, okay, I'm just going to make some stuff cheaper, or I'm going to get my ROI by slashing cost of certain things. Okay, that's cool, but you could actually completely change the way you're doing something. Another example of this, by the way, for what it's worth, is when we think about things like the fact that for years and years and years, writing software was very, very expensive. The most important and costly portion of the thing was the actual writing of the software, the putting of the curly braces into files and then compiling that stuff was really expensive. And that's changed now to the point where now what's actually like the pattern that's emerging is, rather than being like, we have to make sure we know exactly what's going on, we're exactly building this sort of stuff. It's like, why don't we just build a prototype that'll take 3 hours and we can just experiment? And so basically it's, rather than get it right the first time, it's generate and judge. That's just a completely different way of approaching certain classes of development. Right. So like when we do slide decks for customers, for instance, like for a QBR or something, we'll actually sit down and just say, let's just have it, let's just generate a deck, and we'll use the complete deck as a way to start riffing. Right. And then you're in there. And it's just a different way to power sort of that creative process, which before would going to be like, okay, well, once we're done, we're going to need to send it to the graphic designer. So like everybody make sure it's good before we do that because they're really expensive.
It is interesting, like when you start thinking, again, going back to your example of like, hey, with change in manufacturing doesn't mean that you get to do more cheap stuff. It means you get an opportunity just to completely rethink manufacturing, and you can do across these. In the same way, I've heard the same analogy with electrification of factory plants and textile mills and all that, how it wasn't just take the old loom and shove electricity into it. It was like, actually, we now need to rethink about how the whole production thing comes along. And we have that opportunity within technologies. So I'd actually ask you, could you go a little more specific on that? Like if you're a CIO and you're having this problem in front of you and you're like, okay, I don't want to have I don't want to have the thing you call like the poverty of the vision. Like you want to have a vision that is rich, you want to have a time scale that is appropriate. How do you get through that headspace? Like what are some of the thinking of models, are the mental models or old baggage or things that we need to let go so that we can arrive there?
Yeah. So one of the things I would do is I would challenge folks to say like, there's a number of mental games that I play when I do this. So a lot of times, particularly as a CIO, you're thinking about things in terms of like big systems, right? And you probably have in your head sort of a picture of like, okay, well, in my business, things flow through this system like this, and we have quality control here, and then there's some stuff going on, and then periodically we upgrade and that sort of stuff. So like you have this just schematic in your head of the way that the system works. And so one of the questions I would ask somebody if you've got that picture is, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument you have an infinite number of people. Let's play that game. Infinite number of people. So now anything that you were gating on people for a second, let's just pretend that you don't have to anymore. What might change about your process? So for a good example of this, if you're saying like, okay, well, we do quality control on some of the outputs. Well, now you can do quality control on every single output, right? Like it's no longer going to be, you don't have to do quality control by sampling if you work in a factory, or if you're a CIO and you're looking at particular alarms and you're like, oh, okay, well, we're going to monitor certain places. You can now monitor all the places, right? You can watch every single, input value, of a process because it's not going to cost you nearly as much. So that's one of the things. The second thing is, because generation is now so cheap, you can work toward that personalization thing. That doesn't just apply in marketing. That actually can apply almost anywhere. So you used to have these forms. You used to have like, if you went to a help desk portal or something like this, there'd be like a catalog and you press the button and you do the drop down and you're like, it's this category of thing. And then your end user is like, is this a communication problem or is it a network problem? I don't understand the difference, that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, none of that matters anymore, right? Because you now have this like world brain that you can slide in there to do the categorization for you. So rather than like, worrying about that, you can go ahead and just remove that load from your end users and be like, show up conversationally, right? That opens up a tremendous amount of sort of like better flow. The last thing is the tools themselves used to be a lot of the problem. Getting the data into and out of the tools used to be a lot of the problem that people were going to run into when doing IT at scale, right? So if you just imagine like you have a CRM, getting that thing, keeping it updating, doing the analytics. The CRO wants a report once every other day about like what's going on with the pipeline and blah, 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 blah. And that stuff, like that took a lot of resource and a lot of time. Now we can plug in MCP service to a lot of our tooling, and you can basically say to every single person in the organization, hey, if you want to do analytics, just start asking questions and it can go, right? Yeah. That's the kind of enabling technology where like, okay, now I have an infinite number of people. I have an infinite number of people in my sales ops team. So the cost of doing reporting drops to almost nothing. Okay, cool. What does my sales meeting actually look like now, right? Like if I'm the CIO and I'm helping you, the CRO, design your business process, I mean, like, do you really need that meeting? Like it's just like you're going to show up and you can review those metrics every minute.
That's it. Trust me, our CRO, the company I would love to do that too. That's a really interesting point. Like I like this mental frame of saying, imagine you have 1,000, maybe an infinite people. Then you get an opportunity. It's kind of like you say, where you get to rebuild how you do manufacturing. You get to rebuild how time is distributed in your company, and you get to have these signals. So that sense of thinking, okay, what was the constraint before? Not what was the problem, like what were the real constraints? And the constraint was, okay, we need people in a room to get the information flowing, to do the thing, to get the context. Oh, now we have context. Now we can just reimagine this.
And there's just, that is actually like related to like an old school problem solving methodology, which is effectively like, okay, think about the problem you're facing and just assume for a second it's solved. Just assume you don't have it anymore and imagine what the next thing that's going to happen is. And usually by that point, you're like, oh, I know how to solve the problem. right? Because you have now imagined the world you actually want to be in, right?
Yeah, skip the constraint, assume it's solved, get to the other outcome, and then build for that, and then your constraint opposite gets solved. Love that. So let's actually level this up a little bit. I want to take another view. So we are barreling towards halfway through 2026. This is the year of agentic AI. Technically, it was last year, but this is for real this year. It's happening this year. So when a board or an executive team is really committing like a significant amount of money because they are ready, there's this round 2 of their transformation, they're ready to succeed, and they put this money behind AI initiatives. The question I have is around that foundation that a lot of these companies are trying to build on top of. Often, that foundation is weak, it is brittle, there are issues across technology. I'd like you to expand on like what you're seeing there from a technology perspective. But then also want to know like the gap between announcement and reality, they're gonna happen. So who takes responsibility for that? Is it the job of the CIO? Is it the CISO? Is it the CEO? Someone in the middle? Like, how do we navigate this? Both the reality of the brittleness of the foundation that a lot of enterprises find themselves with the technology, and then also the accountability of when we put time, dollars, and energies behind these transformations, who owns that when we don't realize the fullness of the promise in 2026?
I'll say the first question is a really, really good one because we run into all the time. Like, and I'll invoke this from the security world. Like, rare is the organization you walk into and go, "Do you have a CMDB so I can know where all your assets are?" Like, never. The answer to that is no and never. Right? Like, that's not a thing that exists in the universe. Right? And that's true of a lot of data sources and a lot of things that you would want to connect. If you think about, okay, well, now we've got these very, very expansive thinking machines, they are going to need context on the business in order to make them effective. And the worry, the big issue, and the place a lot of these projects fail is you have people who once they get in there and get over the initial nervousness of like, what can it do? They begin to think it can do everything. And if the data on the back end is crap, the results out the front end are going to be crap. But now it comes with the imprimatur of, oh my God, the AI said. And so then what we see is a lot of people go, okay, well, the graph looks like this. We're going to go do this thing. And you come back and go, yeah, it made that up. Or more, or worse, it connected 2 pieces of bad data. So one of the things that you're going to end up doing is, as you identify a specific problem you're trying to solve, so back to that problem definition of like, okay, we want to rework or revolutionize, more likely, the way that we do Salesforce testing as an example. Okay. So then what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, the thing that we're going to do is we're going to make the graph generation and sort of the analysis portion of it cheaper by interjecting an AI here. It turns out, and actually another one of the things, and not to slam anybody, but to say that one of the other findings of the Stanford report was that the actual intervening technologies, the actual intervening large language model technologies, were largely interchangeable in these projects. So like that's an interesting nugget. But at the end of the day, you're going to put something there. But before that, you're going to want to really take a look and say, like, let's make sure that the data that's backing this is actually reasonably clean. And that might be the investment we have to make up front, is to say, it's powered off this. Is this thing structured well? Can it make the right decisions? So you're going to probably end up with a pilot project that says, I'm going to take people who are at the very, very high end of the cohort who's going to be using this. I'm going to arm them with this, and we're going to sit down and like go through common use cases and just make sure, okay, are we seeing the right set of stuff? Then when you're rolling it out, you're going to end up having your initial folks, your pioneers, go out to the more town planner types and sit with them, and that's that one-on-one coaching. So you're going to see it roll out, but you didn't do that before you took a real inventory of the technologies you were connecting. This is a thing that we've had to do because we've internally with our own company, we've connected up. I've got my HubSpot data is connected up. I've got Hex data over here with the tons of metrics and things like this, and everything is connected. But as we were doing that, we had a person who was actually a data engineer who took a look at the data catalog and made sure, these things are called enough of the same thing. And when we set up our Claude MD file, we have to let it know that there's a few mappings here and that sort of stuff. Like, you need to spend a few minutes doing that. The last thing, you asked, like, whose responsibility is it, right? Okay, so one of the things that is, I think, difficult, particularly if you have a board, and particularly I would assume, I have never been a C-level executive at a publicly traded company, but I'm sure it's even worse. When you're using a technology that's potentially transformational and you want to try to be transformational, you have got to give the organization the room to fail, right? And so when I think about who's responsible, well, what ends up happening is you're going to end up having a CIO who's like, we'll deliver the tech with you, and a CRO in this example, for instance, who's like, okay, and we're your guinea pig. We're working in tandem. But you've got a CEO who needs to be there going like, I understand what you're trying to do, and I understand which metrics we think are going to move, and I'm going to get down in there, and I'm going to understand the project well enough that if the metrics don't move the right way, the question I'm going to ask is not who to fire, but it's why didn't they? What can we do? What have we learned? Because this is the opportunity to build a learning engine so that, your 61% of your projects failed the first time around, but they then achieved the second time around. Yeah, okay, that's actually like, that's probably going to be the batting average for a while. One of the things I think is so interesting, if I can put it in a different perspective, okay, is if I walked into an organization in the 1800s and I said, okay, I took a rock, I shoved lightning inside it, and then I taught the rock how to think. Here you go, transform your business. It's going to take them one or two tries to figure out how to use that thing, right? And that is literally what we've got. That's just another way to say this is what we're looking at. And so when you look at the average organization, if you as the leadership are like, you better not screw this up the first time, oof, that's probably the wrong thing. So you're going to want to talk to your board and be like, we're launching these experiments. This is what we're measuring. This is what we've learned. This is what we're doing next. And just like we are a learning organization, you got to have that culture to really, really succeed, or you got to wait for it to become commodity. Those are kind of your options.
I think what you were just describing was just like really those two things: real leadership and real change management, and both are hard.
Oh yeah. Well, it's so funny to me. Almost no matter what. So like if you go back to like the pyramids, like they actually have like clay tablets that have people talking about the projects are late and this sucks and these guys aren't getting the bricks or whatever the hell it was. Like it's always been like this is people doing people stuff with people things, and I don't care how advanced that technology is. At the end of the day, it has to sit right next to squishy people, and all of the right set of stuff has to happen.
I worked with the VP of engineering, and his favorite phrase was, "People are gonna people."
Yeah,
just like that's it. You're dealing with humans who are doing humans. So I want to take a bit of a transition here. Yeah. I actually want to lean back on leveraging your insights from your time, like cleanly in the cybersecurity space, when you were a Mandiant and then Expel, and how that translates into the moment we're having right now with technology broadly across organizations, and specifically with incident management and incident response. So from a cybersecurity perspective, we have seen threat actors adopt AI as everyone predicted, but now that it's real, it's got rather visceral. So the Cystic Threat Research team has put out multiple things that are around this. One of them is around, they've seen threat actors using LLMs to go from initial access to administrative privileges in under 10 minutes in cloud accounts. We've seen disclosures of a vulnerability to exploitation to owning applications happening under 10 hours. Our team put out some research around that. This compression of how adversaries are using technology to do harm, how are you seeing, if you are seeing, are you seeing this show up from an IT perspective where you're seeing failures that are compounding, either them being malicious or just like operational failures? How is AI playing in this? And then how does AI show up in like incident management and incident response?
I would start with, and we actually, I talked about a little bit about this with some security practitioners in New York last week, and one of the general conclusions, this has happened over the history of security, where sort of the advantage has sloshed back and forth between the attackers and defenders, depending on sort of like the technology du jour. And right now, like no one should make any mistake, the attackers definitively have the advantage, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think about there is, we haven't, like at the Fixify level, we in the IT world have tended to see much more things that are just sort of just garden variety, IT troubling and things like this. But we've started to have conversations with people who are starting to think about, okay, what would this actually mean if I had a fast moving adversary in my environment? And one of the things that was interesting, just from the experience of Mandiant, is the difference between a nation state, or a difference between an actual gunslinger, somebody who knows what they're doing, and somebody who's in their mom's basement, used to be vast. Right. It was, and we would do this. I mean, we could literally look at like the TTPs and go, okay, we know who that is, right? Because like it's that bespoke and unique. And this type of capability is now, pretty close to off the shelf, right? So I think that thing, should alarm security practitioners into a certain type of action. And that goes to like the second piece, which is like, how do you respond? Because you know that the fast moving thing is going to happen. Like that's kind of a thing. And you have to think about it and go, okay, do I have a legitimate risk map? Do I have a legitimate response plan? Do I have the ability to actually act properly? So, as an example, of the old school APT3 group used to move like wildfire through an organization, right? And like a lot of times the answer to that was turn off your internet for a little while. You're going to need a minute, right? And so what are your compensating controls for that class of thing? Which then goes to your secondary question, which is like, from an incident responder perspective, there is, I think, if not hope, it's at least a glimmer of hope, which is that one of the hardest things when you were responding to an incident, and I used to say this to people all the time, was like the worst question in security during an incident is what now, right? And that you run into that all the time. Like if you don't do this all day, every day, like you're rusty and you're like, oh, okay, does anyone remember the command for this on this tech? You do have now automation and technologies that can help you with this, and the AI SOC companies and MDRs are all beginning to staff up with this class of stuff. So reaction times get better, and the sort of the what nexts get more complete and more effortless and that sort of thing. So you're relying a little less on just like one guy, like an Earl in the back, who's just banging it out. You've actually got now a team of people who, like, even if they don't do it for their day job, they can sort of consult the Oracle and they get some of the right set of stuff. I think longer term, though, we're going to have to really, really think about some dynamics here around what does protection really look like? What does response look like? It's changing that game pretty dynamically. But like I said, it's a little bit early days on this. The other thing I'd say is on the IT side, the thing that we are seeing is like now that pressure that everyone had always felt and sort of ignored around patch discipline and stuff like this has now turned into like an honest to God, like, okay, now we just need to find a place to lay down and die. Like that's, and if you think about the average, and it was always this way, let's be clear. If you go back to like the Verizon data breach report for any year, pick out the age of the average vulnerability that was used to exploit things, it was usually 5 years old, right? And that was just like we could just take advantage of bad patching stuff. But now that I can reverse engineer a patch from a binary, or an attack from a binary, like oof, like we gotta up our game.
Zero Signal is brought to you by Hampton North. I've been responsible for building and turning around cybersecurity programs for companies where a lapse in security just isn't an option. Finance, high tech, AI. Different domains, but the same truth. The programs live and die on talent. And no strategy ships without the right people who share the right DNA. That's why I partner with Hampton North. I've built 3 cybersecurity teams with them, and every time they move faster than anyone else without sacrificing quality. While other agencies are still pushing paperwork, Hampton North already had vetted candidates in front of me. Their executive search is not one size fits all. With one of the largest networks of security leaders in the US, their leadership roles hit the market in days, sometimes hours. And their go-to-market practice covers CROs, CMOs, revenue leaders, and full team build-outs for scaling cybersecurity businesses. They meet every candidate, they reference every story. If you're ready to build and scale and grow your security program, go to hamptonnorth.com and see why brands like Clear, Instacart, Airtable, and OpenAI trust Hampton North to build great teams. Check out the link in the description. So actually, I want to come back to something you mentioned, like turning off the internet for the APT3 group. So I want to circle back on that because I think it's an interesting insight to go there. But on that point, on just the cycle time on patching. So my colleague Sergey put out the 0-day clock, and it went back to 2018, and you can visually see the collapse of the time. It used to take near 2 years for a threat actor to go like, okay, there's a vulnerability in the wild. I'm going to reverse this into an exploit. I'm going to have these campaigns. It's going to make it to the 2018 version of the CISA Kev. It's like, great. And we would see it there. Now we're at the place where it's less than 1 day. Less than 1 day, we put on an advisory saying, not even a proof of concept, just being like, here's a text description of the problem. And we're seeing it weaponized, exploited in the wild. So to your point about, let's go lay down and die because patching is terrible. Like, yeah, patching sucks. So we have to totally rethink patching too, which is a really interesting moment of like, writing your own patches, writing your own mitigating controls. So
well, and to that point, like one of the things that I've been thinking about, and it's like sort of in the back of my head, like my crystal ball is as foggy as everybody else's. But one of the things I think about when I challenge myself on the like, what if you had an infinite number of security professionals to help protect your environment? Like, what would you do, right? Yeah. And would you plop one inside every single device that you have, watching for certain classes of things and things like this? Like, is that a possibility for the way to go? And the same thing's true of the vulnerabilities. Would you end up being able to spool up some sort of like vulnerability detection capability that was, the envy of things. I don't think your average company is going to do that, but I think that this opens up potential doors for vendors to look at and go, okay, we need to rethink the way that we do this kind of stuff. One other thing, though, to just say is like there was for a long time there was a real problem with the cost of signal, right? So like when the signal to noise ratio off of security monitoring devices was so high, a lot of work just had to go into and it's filtering and it's correlating and it's doing stuff so you can try to figure out what the hell is going on and this sort of stuff. And one of the things I do think, one advantage to defenders that exists now and companies are using now, I mean, everybody from profit drops on things like this, is to say, okay, look, like we can use AI so that we can look at more and respond more effectively. And so that part at the very least has moved the needle. Now, I don't think it's enough. I think if you're a CISO, you're not going to buy one of those technologies and be like, well, I can call it a day. But at the very least, it is an advantage, or to have an MDR that has some of that AI technology built in. From that perspective, does give you a little bit of an edge because they're also playing that game of what if we had an infinite number of people watching every signal, right? And so that's the really thing you want to be doing.
So that idea you're describing earlier, where it's like going from vulnerability to remediation and cycling that, there's this new concept. We'll have a whole podcast conversation around it called VulnOps. So Bruce Schneier and many others are talking about how this is going to be the next thing when it comes to having continuous agents. You mentioned your point of like an infinite security army, looking at your own code, finding the vulnerabilities, generating the patches, generating the tests, applying them. So yeah, we'll leave the audience with that, and we'll tease you guys on that on VulnOps and come back to it later. But Matt, I wanted to get your take. If you're coaching or advising, as you coach and advise CISOs and CIOs in this moment of transformation, you mentioned earlier about the APT3 group and how they would move so fast back in the day. And it was just faster than most defenders could keep up. So the right call for the business was to turn off, remove your access to the internet for a few days, go through, clean up, kick the threat actor out, and then bring your business online. Like, that is a hell of a call to make. So in a world now where the things are collapsing so fast and you have these timelines collapsing, how does a leader navigate that moment? Or how do we still have the courage to make these big calls where it's like, we need to take the business down for 3 days, or whatever that means in today's moment? What's your counsel to CISOs and CIOs who are facing very fast-moving threat actors or cascading technological failures, and they need to step in and do something different?
I think a couple of things I would call out. So the first one is like everyone who is in a position where they would have to make that decision, right? And that might not be in your organization, the CISO. It might be the head of security operations or something like that. Whoever is going to get the call in the middle of the night to say, this is what's going on. We don't have time to ring the CEO. What do we do, right? Like that, those people are decision points. The same thing is true in IT. When you end up like getting the report that there's an outage or there's some sort of issue or something's going on, like there are a few key people in the organization that decision is going to roll up to be like, we are now going to mitigate at a different level than have you turned it off and on again, right? And so in those cases, what's going to want to happen is those people are going to want to have a pretty firm grip on effectively the cost of risk in the organization, right? And so there is, and I'm not saying you need to go all the way through any one of the big frameworks and go like, okay, probability times impact, like that. But you probably have in your mind a good notion of like, okay, here are the crown jewels, here are the things. There are 3 or 4 things. And one of the places you can go for this, by the way, if you're a security leader, you might take a spin by your general counsel's office and just say, hey, GC, can you tell me what your risk register is just off the top of your head and how many zeros are attached to each one of those things?
Yeah.
Because you'd actually be shocked. A lot of times the answers are not what you think they are, right? And so you in cybersecurity should have a similar thing, which is like, okay, if they pop the production infrastructure, but it happens to be, in this portion of the thing, okay, that's a remediation, but it's relatively well contained. If we see it off of this class of laptop, we've got real problem, ... There's those sorts of things. And you want to just have kind of that register in your head where you can make a relatively quick decision to say like, okay, this is run of the mill, the team's going to handle it. This is wake people up and start really, really moving the business. This is shut the thing down because it's world ending, like that kind of a category. I will tell you that one of the things that has a tendency for people to do, and this is where really good CISOs come in handy, is to understand that not every risk is world ending, And not everything is not everything is the Huns invading from the north, right? Like I was just like, there are classes of these things, and there are moments when you want to be like, okay, yes, that sounds terrible. Yes, I get it. But like, we've got mitigating controls in place, it's going to be okay. Or no, this one is actually factually a really, really big deal. Like our entire business is wrapped up in our intellectual property, which is over there. And from all intents and purposes, it looks like they're staging, and we might already have Expel. Turn off the internet right now, right? Like that's just the don't even pass go and collect $200 kind of a thing. So that's the thing I would advise folks, is to think about, do you have a model of the business and the risks, and then have you run that past the other people in the exec team, including general counsel and the CEO, and said, this is sort of what's in my head about what decisions look like, that sort of thing, right?
Got it. Now, I think that's really good counsel to remember, like, as a technology or security leader, if you feel that you're in the place, like you have to make the call, you're probably in the wrong position immediately. Like, you have to do what you described there. Go talk to your general counsel, or enrich that perspective with your CFO, and have a consortium of understanding of, like, get a consortium together so you have an understanding, a shared understanding of like what's really risk and what these trigger points mean. Because at some point, I don't know, I think we're getting to a world where like agents are going to start making some of these decisions.
So one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at like one question you might want to do, if people listening to this who are security professionals do not run tabletop exercises, like, you need to do that. And one of the things that you're going to find out very quickly, and like the first question you're going to ask, you pull the tabletop together and you're like, okay, this just happened. What do we do? There's always the canonical, like, no one remembers where the incident response plan is, and like wouldn't know it off the top of their head, but they do have a sense of who they're going to call. And then you just ask them, what's their phone number? And like the crickets, where you realize like, oh, actually, we don't know. And it's like, yeah, you're going to have to go into Slack or into Rippling, and you're going to pull that up. And by the time that happens, 20 minutes are gone, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that the accelerative property of agents and the sort of like autonomous attack vehicles is going to change a little bit how these escalations actually happen. So you may well end up having to define this stuff up front and just hope that the agents make the right call. And then you're getting a phone call to say, hey, by the way, the cyborgs have just done this to protect us from the other cyborgs. And I don't know, as I'm describing that does sound like a little bit of a post-apocalyptic hellscape, but like, yeah, that's where we're headed.
So let me return the favor by me plugging a book into this podcast. I can't quite keep up. I'll give you one though. There's a great book called Turn the Ship Around. And it's by a naval commander who got 6 months to basically get a submarine ready to go out. And usually you get like 2 years to study a submarine. And to my understanding, the way he lays it out is that like submarine commanders, everything runs up to them. They make all the decisions, that information flows out, and they basically just don't sleep for their entire tour because every decision has to run past them. And he's like, this is going to work. And he changes it, enter the new philosophy. But one of the things he talks about is this idea of balancing control. So you have competence on one side of the axis, and then you have capabilities on the others. And you want to have like you want more competence and more control. I'm not going to explain the whole philosophy. It's really cool. But anyway, this whole language comes out. This whole thing is you want intent-based leadership, where you stop asking for permission, but people have enough authority and context that they go, I intend to do this. I think there's a world of like what you're describing there and bringing it into the world of real-time agents. So whether it's like through Profit Security, who's like using technology to help MDR get like really real time, or Fixify, where you guys are using technology on the IT space. It's like, if the agent realizes, I don't quite have enough context, let me back off and put forward a recommendation. Or if I do, I'm going to do it and then tell you that I did it. And like being able to calibrate that based off of context, or an awareness, not just capabilities.
And can I riff off that for just a second? One of the things that we're seeing as we have folks who are adopting more workflows that are rooted in LLM-based technology, where it's just sort of like kind of a bit of a free-for-all, or they're using agent-based technology, but they're able to just describe whatever they want. One of the things that we're realizing is a lot of that work is very, very close to what good management, right? You want to describe what you want at the end of it. You are not going to necessarily spend a bunch of time thinking about the steps to get there, and you're going to let those the agentic technologies kind of figure that out. And one of the things is that's actually hard. Like actually sitting down and being like, okay, what am I trying to accomplish at sort of an ephemeral level? Many people think through what they're doing by doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And so training that a little bit out of people is kind of a little bit of a difficult thing, and watching people sort of put those things down is pretty tough, but it is an interesting journey. And once people get good at that, yeah, you do have this amazing amplification of the output of the organization. You're like, people are showing up, like, I had somebody do this entire analysis of, okay, like we're going to open another location where, and like they showed up and they were like, okay, I have compared 3 locations all the way down to like direct flights to various and sundry ... And like A few years ago, that just wasn't a thing. Like you'd be convening an entire panel to be, you guys go collect this and we'll put it in, and now it's just, fingertips, right? So kind of cool.
So when you look towards the future, you mentioned earlier that your glass ball is as foggy as everyone else's. So recognizing that, but as you're looking at the future here, what are the skills that you think are durable for leaders and practitioners? And we'll focus on maybe the more leadership side, but like, what does this mean as we make these transformations? In a couple of years' time, we're going to have just more systems with our AI. We're going to have more processes that are AI-centric. We won't be looking at 51 companies that successfully did their transformations on AI. The studies will be a much larger cohorts. But what skills should we as leaders continue to focus on and double down on? What's going to survive this next iteration of transformation in business technology?
It's a really good question. And one of the things I would say is there's a bunch of higher level traits. So like calling out that like when I think about competence in any job, I think about sort of experience, which is like all the stuff that you've done. So like I have done certain things. So if you ask me to do it right now, I'd just be able to do it because I've done it. And then skills, which are like I can write Python or whatever, I can do a spreadsheet, that kind of thing. But traits are things like I am curious, right? Or I am a systems thinker, that sort of thing. And I think that like the traits are the things that long-term in your career, no matter what technology environment you have, are the things that serve you well. And leaders in general that I find like are successful tend to be folks who are systems thinkers, right? They can sort of see, if I change this, that's going to move all the way over here. Like that capability is actually really, really important. The further up in an organization you go, the more you need to amplify your efforts. That systems thinking is really important. It's interesting because communication skills are actually really, really important, right? I think LLMs will make written communication skills a little bit less unavailable. Like they'll make them a little bit more available. But what I don't think will happen is clarity of communication reflects a clarity of thought, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is even if the LLM is going to write the thing for you, don't lose the skill of writing. Right? Because writing is the keyhole through which our thoughts pass. And if we cannot marshal our thoughts in a coherent way and we count on an LM to do it, very quickly I find we will end up just sort of thrashing about. And if anybody's got a team that's experimenting with AI, you may have run into this before where you show up and like the amount of output for the team is just tremendous. And all of the words and tokens have been burned and that sort of stuff. And you show up and you go, what are you doing? And you get the sort of like, it's crickets, right? Like it's clarity of thinking is really, really key. I think the other thing is understanding whatever business you're in and having the curiosity to really engage with that. I interview CIOs. Like I do this a lot. I talk to like hundreds of customers, CIOs, things like this. And one of the things every single one of them has is that they have a curiosity and they've learned about the rest of their business, right? So at the exact same time that LLMs and agentic technology may be reducing the specific domain expertise, premium, right? At the exact same time, you're going to want to look and be like, okay, do I understand the business that I'm in? Like I'm an executive. I understand, what our go-to-market strategy is. I understand what our ROI is. I understand what we're doing to improve CAC, that sort of stuff. And then I'm going to apply my systems thinking to helping out with that. So that's like a long way of saying that's what I think is kind of going to help people to survive is that sort of thing.
Well, that was an incredible way. I don't think it's a better way to like end this and land this plane. So Matt, just thank you so much for coming on the show today. Again, Matt is the co-founder and CEO of Fixify, former chief product officer of Expel, the former VP of worldwide operations at Mandiant during the height of the APT era. Matt, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I've got lots of books to go read. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. Tons of fun.
If today's conversation gave you something useful, a framework, a question worth sitting with, a way to position something you're already dealing with, that's the point. Connect with Conor and I on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. Tell us what landed.
And if you know another security leader who's navigating the same pressure, text them this episode. We'll see you next time.
Resonate.